Picture this. You're a hungry student at the University of Paris in 1250, and you need a copy of Aristotle's Physics for your philosophy degree. No Amazon Prime, no local bookstore, not even a printing press. Your only option? Hope some monk in a monastery feels like spending the next 6 months copying it by hand. Unless, of course, you know about the secret weapon that revolutionized medieval education faster than you could say student loan debt. Welcome to the world of university stationers and the PCA system, the medieval equivalent of a high-speed copying network that made books flow through universities like water through a broken dam. While most people think the printing press was the first game changer in book production, they're dead wrong. Centuries before Gutenberg ever dreamed of movable type, medieval scholars had already cracked the code on mass-producing manuscripts. And they did it with nothing but quills, parchment, and a system so clever it would make modern logistics experts weep with envy. Before we dive into this fascinating world of medieval book hustlers, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you're about to learn something that will completely change how you think about medieval universities. And after you've had your mind blown by these ingenious copying techniques, drop a comment telling me what surprised you most about medieval book production. Now, let's step inside a 13th century stationer's shop and watch the magic happen. The whole system started with something that sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry: licensing. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely crucial to understanding how medieval universities stayed one step ahead of educational chaos. University masters weren't just teachers. They were quality control officers with the power to make or break the entire academic book trade. When a master wanted to approve a text for student use, he didn't just glance at it and say, "Looks good." This guy would examine every single word, every punctuation mark, every abbreviation. He was looking for the cleanest, most accurate copy available, what they called an exemplar. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a master recording in a music studio. Everything else would be copied from this perfect original. But here's the brilliant part that most people miss. These masters understood something that wouldn't become obvious to the rest of the world for centuries. They knew that accuracy wasn't just about having one perfect copy sitting on a shelf somewhere. It was about creating a system where hundreds of copies could be made without turning into a medieval game of telephone, where Aristotle says becomes a rusty turtle says by the time it reaches the 10th copyist. The master's approval wasn't just a rubber stamp, it was a guarantee. When he signed off on an exemplar, he was essentially saying, "I stake my academic reputation on this text." And in a world where your reputation was literally everything, that meant something. These guys took their job more seriously than a food critic reviewing a Michelin-starred restaurant. Once the master gave his blessing, the real magic began at the stationer's shop. These weren't just bookstores. They were sophisticated production facilities that would have impressed Henry Ford himself. The stationer would take that precious exemplar and do something that sounds simple, but was actually revolutionary: break it apart. Not physically, of course. That would have been academic suicide. Instead, they created what we call the PCA system. Each exemplar got divided into numbered sections called PCA, each one roughly the size of a booklet or quire. Imagine taking a modern textbook and dividing it into chapters, but instead of chapters, you're working with sections that are exactly the right size for one person to copy in about a day. The stationer kept meticulous records of these divisions. Every petya got registered with its contents, its position in the overall work, and its rental status. They created what was essentially the medieval world's first inventory management system. A typical Aristotle text might be broken down into 20 or 30 PCA, each one carefully numbered and catalogued. But here's where the system gets truly ingenious. Instead of having one copyist work on the entire book from start to finish, which could take months, the stationer could rent out all the PCA simultaneously to different copyists. Picture 20 scribes working on 20 different sections of the same book at the same time. By the time the first guy finished copying PCA 1, The 20th guy was done with Picia 20. The whole book could be completed in the time it used to take to copy just one section. The rental system itself was pure business genius. Students and professional copyists would come to the stationer's shop and rent Picia by the day, kind of like checking out library books, except these books were specifically designed to be copied. The rental fees were carefully calculated, high enough to make the business profitable, but low enough that even struggling students could afford them. Each Picia came with strict rules. You had to return it by a specific time, usually within 24 hours. Late returns meant fines, and repeat offenders could find themselves banned from the rental system entirely. The stationers weren't messing around. Their entire business model depended on keeping those Picia moving through the system like clockwork. The copyists themselves ranged from wealthy students making extra money to professional scribes who made their living churning out manuscripts. Some worked alone in their rooms, hunched over crude desks by candlelight. Others gathered in copying halls where they could share supplies and probably complain about cramped hands and eye strain. The physical act of copying wasn't as simple as just writing words on paper. Medieval manuscripts required specific layouts, precise spacing, and standardized formats that made them easy to read and reference. Copyists had to rule their parchment or paper with perfectly straight lines, creating columns that matched university standards. Every page looked like a carefully planned architectural blueprint. They developed shorthand systems and abbreviations that would make modern texters jealous. Common words got compressed into symbols, and frequently used phrases had their own special marks. A skilled copyist could write etc. with a single flourish, or abbreviate manuscript down to just a few pen strokes. These weren't just time savers. They were essential skills that separated the professionals from the amateurs. The fastest copyists could complete an entire Picia in a single day, but that was pushing it. Most took their time to ensure accuracy, because errors meant having to start over. One wrong word could throw off an entire philosophical argument, and in a world where academic debates could literally determine your career prospects, accuracy wasn't optional. Meanwhile, back at the stationer's shop, the business was running like a well-oiled machine. Picia were constantly circulating, going out to copyists in the morning, coming back in the evening, getting checked for damage, then going right back out to the next person in line. Popular texts like Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas might have waiting lists, while more obscure works gathered dust until some ambitious student needed them for research. The checking process was crucial. Every returned Picia got inspected for damage, missing pages, or unauthorized annotations. Copyists who returned Picia in poor condition faced penalties, and those who tried to slip in extra notes or corrections without permission found themselves in serious trouble with both the stationer and the university authorities. This entire system created something unprecedented in medieval Europe: a standardized, efficient method for producing multiple copies of the same text simultaneously. It was like having a printing press, except instead of mechanical type, they used human scribes working in perfect coordination. The speed and scale were revolutionary. What used to take a monastery months to produce could now be completed in weeks, with multiple copies rolling off the production line at the same time. The real genius wasn't just in the speed, it was in the quality control that kept everything from falling apart. Every stationer worth his salt employed what we might call medieval fact-checkers, though their job title was usually something like collator or corrector. These weren't just guys who could read, they were academic bloodhounds with an eye for detail that would make modern editors weep with envy. When a copyist finished their Picia and brought it back to the shop, the real scrutiny began. The collator would place the finished copy right next to the original exemplar and go through it word by word, line by line, abbreviation by abbreviation. They weren't just looking for obvious mistakes like Aristotle spelled Aristotle, though that happened more often than you'd think. They were hunting for subtle errors that could completely change the meaning of a philosophical argument. One wrong letter could turn a statement about divine grace into heretical nonsense, and in the 13th century, heretical nonsense could get you burned at the stake. So these collators took their job about as seriously as a bomb disposal expert. They'd mark every error in the margins using a system of symbols that was standardized across universities. A little dot meant a missing letter, a slash meant an extra word, and more complex marks indicated when entire phrases had gone wrong. The really skilled collators could spot problems that weren't technically errors, but could cause confusion. Maybe a copyist had perfectly correct Latin, but used an abbreviation that was common in Paris, but unknown in Bologna. The collator would flag it for standardization. They were like medieval quality assurance managers, except instead of checking widgets on an assembly line, they were ensuring that Thomas Aquinas meant the same thing, whether you read him in France or Italy. But here's where the system gets really interesting from a business perspective. These stationers weren't just running copying services, they were operating what amounted to medieval publishing houses with profit margins that would make modern publishers jealous. Let's talk numbers, because the math behind the PSIRE system is absolutely wild. A typical Picia rental cost about 2 denarii per day. That might not sound like much until you realize that a skilled craftsman made maybe 12 denarii per day. So renting a Picia was like spending a sixth of your daily wages just to borrow someone's textbook for 24 hours. Yet students lined up to pay these fees because the alternative, waiting months or years for a complete copy, was even more expensive in terms of lost time. Professional copyists charged anywhere from 6 to 12 denarii per completed Picia, depending on the complexity of the text and the quality of their work. A scribe who could produce clean, accurate copies of Aristotle's Metaphysics could command premium rates, while someone copying basic grammar texts worked for bargain prices. It was like the difference between being a brain surgeon and a general practitioner. Same basic skills, vastly different paychecks. The stationers themselves were pulling in serious money. A successful shop handling popular university texts could process hundreds of Picia per week during peak academic seasons. Some of the biggest operations in Paris and Bologna were reportedly earning more than wealthy merchants. They had to. The startup costs were enormous. Acquiring exemplars, hiring skilled collators, maintaining rental inventories, and dealing with university bureaucracy required serious capital investment. But the real money was in volume and turnover. A single exemplar broken into 20 Picia could generate rental income from 20 different copyists simultaneously. If each Picia rented for 2 denarii per day and stayed in circulation for 6 days a week, that's 240 denarii per week from just one book. Compare that to the old monastery system, where one monk might spend 3 months copying the same text once, and you can see why stationers were getting rich. The paper and parchment costs tell their own fascinating story. Parchment made from animal skins was incredibly expensive. A single sheet cost about as much as a day's wages for a labourer. But paper, newly arrived from the Islamic world via Spain, was changing everything. It cost roughly 1/10 as much as parchment and was actually easier to write on. Students who couldn't afford parchment copies of Aristotle could get paper versions for a fraction of the cost. This price difference created an interesting class system within the book world. Wealthy students and established scholars still preferred parchment copies. They lasted longer, looked more prestigious, and held their value better. But paper opened up university education to a whole new class of students who could finally afford their own copies of essential texts. It was like the difference between hardcover and paperback books today, except the price gap was even more dramatic. The production workflows inside these stationer shops would have impressed any modern factory manager. They had assembly lines before assembly lines were even a concept. Raw materials came in one end: parchment, paper, ink, quills, and finished books rolled out the other. But unlike a factory producing identical widgets, each book was individually crafted while still maintaining standardized quality. The scribes working on text had to master what was essentially medieval speed writing. They developed hand positions and pen grips that let them work for hours without cramping up. Some could maintain writing speeds that rival modern typists, churning out line after line of perfectly formed letters. The really elite scribes developed personal shorthand systems that let them copy even faster, then go back and expand their abbreviations into full words. Meanwhile, other specialists handled the decorative elements. Rubricators focused on headings and initial letters, using red ink that literally gave us the word rubric. These weren't just pretty decorations. They were functional elements that helped readers navigate complex texts. A well-placed red heading could help a student find a specific argument in Aquinas or locate a particular theorem in Euclid. The marginal annotation system was perhaps the most ingenious part of the whole operation. Instead of random notes scribbled wherever they fit, medieval manuscripts used standardized symbols and placement rules for different types of commentary. Biblical references went in one margin, philosophical objections in another, and cross-references to other texts in a third location. It was like having a built-in hyperlink system centuries before computers existed. Quality control happened at multiple stages throughout the process. Scribes checked their own work before submitting PCA. Collators verified accuracy against exemplars, and final inspectors examined completed books before they left the shop. Some stationers even offered warranties. If you found errors in your finished copy within a certain time period, they'd fix them for free. Customer service wasn't exactly a medieval invention, but these guys were definitely early adopters. The binding process itself revealed how thoroughly the stationers had thought through their business model. Instead of elaborate covers that took days to create, they developed standardized binding techniques that were sturdy enough to protect the contents, but simple enough to complete quickly. Many used what we'd recognize as perfect binding today, individual pages sewn together into signatures, then bound between simple covers. Fancy decorative bindings were available for customers willing to pay extra, but the standard product focused on functionality over flash. Distribution networks extended far beyond individual stationer shops. Universities developed systems for sharing exemplars between cities, and successful stationers often had business relationships across multiple academic centers. A popular text approved in Paris might appear in Bologna's PCA catalogues within months. It was an early form of intellectual property licensing, though the legal frameworks were much looser than what we'd recognize today. The record-keeping systems these operations developed were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Stationers tracked which PCA were rented to whom, when they were due back, what condition they returned in, and how much each transaction generated. Some shops maintained customer accounts, offering credit to trusted students and bulk discounts to professional copyists who rented multiple PCA regularly. But the PCA system wasn't just revolutionizing book production. It was transforming university education itself by making knowledge accessible in ways that had never been possible before. Students could now afford personal copies of essential texts, which meant they could study at their own pace, make their own notes, and engage with ideas more deeply than ever before. The impact on classroom dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Before the PCA system, university lectures were basically glorified dictation sessions. Professors would slowly read from their single precious copy while students frantically scribbled notes, trying to capture every word before the professor moved on. Miss a sentence because your quill broke. Too bad, you just lost a crucial piece of Aristotle's argument about motion. But now students could walk into lectures already familiar with the text. They'd spent weeks copying it themselves, absorbing every argument, every example, every logical twist. Suddenly, professors found themselves facing rooms full of students who actually understood what they were talking about. Lectures transformed from dictation sessions into actual discussions, debates, and intellectual wrestling matches. This shift created something unprecedented in medieval education. Students who could challenge their professors, not out of disrespect, but because they'd engaged so deeply with the material that they could spot inconsistencies, ask probing questions, and propose alternative interpretations. Some older professors hated this development. They preferred the old days when students sat quietly and absorbed wisdom like sponges. But the younger faculty loved it. Finally, they could teach at the level they'd always wanted to. The note-taking revolution that followed was equally transformative. Students developed increasingly sophisticated systems for cross-referencing their personal copies with lecture content. They'd mark passages that professors emphasized, note contradictions between different texts, and create elaborate indexing systems that turn their books into personalized research tools. Some enterprising students even started selling their annotated copies to younger students, creating a secondary market in pre-owned textbooks that sounds remarkably familiar to anyone who's ever bought used college books. The margins of these well-traveled manuscripts became crowded with layers of commentary, the original students' notes, plus additions from subsequent owners, plus corrections and updates as scholarship evolved. But here's where things get really interesting from an economic perspective. The PISA system didn't just make books cheaper, it completely restructured the economics of being a university student. Before, you either came from a wealthy family that could afford to commission manuscript copies, or you spent years as an apprentice scribe earning enough to buy books. There wasn't much middle ground. The rental system changed everything by spreading costs over time and allowing students to prioritize. Need Aristotle's ethics for this semester. Rent those Pythia first and copy them. Planning to study theology next year? Start saving up for Augustine. Students could budget their book expenses across multiple years, making university education financially feasible for a much broader range of people. This accessibility had profound social implications that rippled through medieval society. University education stopped being exclusively for the wealthy elite and opened up to the sons of merchants, skilled craftsmen, and even some prosperous peasants. The intellectual talent pool exploded as bright minds from across the social spectrum gained access to advanced learning. The stationers themselves became crucial figures in university communities, wielding influence that extended far beyond their shops. They decided which texts to prioritize for Pythia production, effectively controlling what students could easily access. A stationer's decision to break a particular work into Pythia could make the difference between that text becoming widely studied or remaining obscure. Smart professors cultivated relationships with stationers, sometimes offering to provide exemplars of their own works in exchange for favorable Pythia treatment. It was an early form of academic publishing politics, where getting your ideas into circulation required both intellectual merit and business savvy. The competitive dynamics between different stationer shops drove constant innovation in production methods. Some specialized in speed, promising copies faster than their rivals. Others focused on quality, advertising superior accuracy and beautiful script work. A few developed niche markets, becoming known as the go-to source for specific types of texts, legal codes, medical treatises, or theological works. This competition led to some fascinating business strategies. Stationers would scout other shops to see what new exemplars they'd acquired, sometimes engaging in medieval industrial espionage to stay ahead of rivals. They'd hire away each other's best scribes with promises of higher pay or better working conditions. Some even developed exclusive relationships with particular masters, becoming the sole authorized source for certain texts. The seasonal rhythms of university life created predictable boom and bust cycles for the stationer trade. Academic years brought frenzied activity as students rushed to acquire copies of required texts. Summer breaks meant slower business, giving stationers time to prepare new exemplars and train apprentices. The smartest operators learned to smooth out these cycles by developing relationships with monasteries and private collectors who needed copying services year-round. Regional variations in the Pythia system reveal how different universities adapted the basic model to local conditions. Bologna, with its focus on legal studies, developed specialized procedures for copying complex legal texts with elaborate cross-reference systems. Paris, the theological center, created particular expertise in handling scriptural commentaries and doctrinal works. Oxford developed innovations in natural philosophy texts that required precise diagrams and mathematical notation. These regional specializations created a network of intellectual exchange that spanned medieval Europe. A student might begin studies in Paris, continue in Bologna, and finish in Oxford, carrying ideas and texts between universities in ways that would have been impossible under the old monastery-based copying system. The PCA system became the infrastructure that supported medieval Europe's first truly international intellectual community. The technical innovations that emerged from Pugid less essential when PCA Haetia production had lasting impacts on manuscript culture. Stationers developed new ink formulations that dried faster and SMD to move quickly through multiple hands. They experimented with paper treatments that made writing surfaces more consistent and durable. Scribal tools evolved rapidly under the pressure of increased production demands. Quill cutting techniques became more standardized, producing pens that wrote more consistently across different handspeeds to prepare writing surfaces faster without sacrificing quality. The abbrevi. Ruling systems became more precise and efficient, allowing scriation systems that developed during this period were particularly ingenious. Scribes created shorthand methods that could compress common phrases and frequently use terms without losing meaning or readability. These systems became so standardized that a manuscript copied in Paris could be easily read by scholars in Naples, creating a kind of international academic language. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the PCA system wasn't its immediate impact. It was how thoroughly it prepared medieval Europe for the printing revolution that would follow. When Gutenberg started experimenting with movable type in the 1440s, he wasn't working in a vacuum. He was building on centuries of accumulated knowledge about mass book production, standardized formats, and distribution networks. The PCA system had already solved most of the logistical challenges that printing would face. Questions about text standardization, quality control, marketing, and distribution had been worked out through generations of stationer experience. The printing press was revolutionary technology, but it succeeded so quickly because it plugged into an existing infrastructure that had been refined over 2 centuries of manuscript production. The intellectual culture that printing inherited was also fundamentally shaped by PCA production. Students and scholars had already grown accustomed to having personal copies of texts, to making extensive notes and cross-references, and to engaging with ideas through detailed textual analysis. When printed books arrived, they were entering a world that was already primed for widespread literacy and individual study. Even the financial models that early printers adopted bore striking resemblances to stationer practices. The subscription systems that funded many early printed books worked exactly like PCA rental networks. Customers paid in advance for access to texts, spreading costs across multiple buyers while ensuring producers could cover their expenses before starting work. The quality assurance methods that made printed books trustworthy were direct descendants of medieval collation techniques. Early printers employed correctors who checked proof sheets against exemplars, using the same systematic approaches that stationers had perfected. The symbols and marks they used to indicate errors were often identical to those developed in manuscript shops centuries earlier. But the human cost of this transformation gets overlooked in most histories of the book trade. The PCA system had created thousands of jobs for skilled scribes, collators, and support staff across medieval Europe. These weren't just any jobs. They were well-paying positions that required years of training and provided stable careers for educated workers. When printing arrived, it didn't gradually replace manuscript production. It demolished it almost overnight. A single printing press could produce more books in a month than a busy stationer shop managed in a year. The economic logic was brutal and undeniable. Within decades, most manuscript production had vanished, except for the most specialized applications. The social disruption was massive, but largely invisible to modern historians who focus on printing's benefits. thousands of skilled scribes found their expertise suddenly worthless. Master collators, who'd spent decades perfecting their error detection abilities, discovered that mechanical reproduction made their jobs obsolete. Entire neighborhoods in university towns that had thrived on manuscript production turned into economic wastelands. Some former scribes managed to transition into the printing trade, but their traditional skills didn't translate well. Operating a printing press required different knowledge than wielding a quill. The careful hand-eye coordination that made someone excellent at manuscript copying was useless when dealing with mechanical typesetting. Many experienced manuscript workers found themselves competing for entry-level positions with much younger apprentices. The stationers themselves faced a different kind of challenge. Those who adapted quickly to become book publishers and distributors often thrived in the new system. But the transition required significant capital investment in printing equipment, new facilities, and completely different supply chains. Many smaller operators who'd built successful manuscript businesses over generations simply couldn't afford to make the switch. The speed of change caught everyone off guard. University administrators who'd spent decades building relationships with manuscript stationers suddenly found themselves negotiating with an entirely new breed of businessman. The personal connections and trust relationships that had governed manuscript production gave way to more impersonal commercial arrangements. Students experienced the transition as both liberation and loss. Printed books were cheaper and more widely available than manuscripts had ever been. A student could now own more books in a single semester than previous generations, accumulated over entire academic careers. The democratization of knowledge was real and immediate. Yet something intangible was lost in the transition. The intimate relationship between student and text that came from copying every word by hand disappeared. Reading a manuscript you'd copied yourself created a different kind of engagement with ideas than reading the same text from a printed page. Many scholars complained that students seemed less connected to their books, less likely to remember details, more superficial in their analysis. The note-taking culture that had flourished during the manuscript era also changed dramatically. When books were rare and expensive, students developed elaborate systems for extracting and organizing information from limited sources. Printed books were cheap enough that students could own multiple copies, leading to different study habits that emphasized breadth over depth. The standardization that printing brought had unexpected educational consequences. Manuscript copies of the same text often contained slight variations, different word choices, alternative phrasings, or regional spelling preferences. These variations forced students to think critically about textual authority and meaning. Printed books eliminated most of this variation, making texts more consistent but also more rigid. Regional intellectual traditions that had flourished under manuscript production began to homogenize under printing's influence. The Bologna approach to legal texts, or the Paris method of theological commentary, started blending into more standardized formats, dictated by printing economics, rather than local scholarly preferences. The apprenticeship systems that had trained manuscript workers for centuries collapsed almost completely. Young people who might have spent years learning scribal arts found those skills had no market value. The printing trade required different kinds of training, more mechanical, less artistic, focused on production efficiency rather than individual craftsmanship. Guild structures that had protected manuscript workers proved inadequate for dealing with printing's disruption. The old guilds were organized around traditional crafts like scribing, illumination, and binding. Printing cut across these boundaries, creating new job categories that didn't fit existing organizational structures. Labor disputes became common as workers struggled to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The international networks that stationers had built over centuries initially helped some transition to printing, but ultimately worked against them. The same trade connections that had made manuscript distribution efficient also made it easy for printed books to flood markets that had previously been protected by geography and transportation costs. Cities that had specialized in manuscript production faced economic crisis as their primary industry evaporated. University towns like Bologna and Paris managed to adapt because they had diversified economies, but smaller centers that had built their prosperity around scribal work struggled to find new sources of income. The irony is that printing's success depended entirely on foundations laid by the manuscript trade. Every aspect of book production, distribution, and consumption that made printing viable had been pioneered by stationers and scribes working within the Picia system. The printing press was revolutionary technology, but it succeeded because it inherited 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to make books work as commercial products. The story of medieval stationers and the Picia system isn't just ancient history, it's a preview of every technological disruption that followed. The pattern of innovation building on existing infrastructure, then suddenly making that infrastructure obsolete, would repeat itself countless times. From steam engines replacing water mills to computers eliminating typing pools, the same dynamics that transformed medieval book production continue shaping economic change today. Understanding how medieval scholars solved the problem of knowledge distribution helps us appreciate both the ingenuity of human problem solving and the inevitability of technological change. The stationers who built the Picia system created something remarkable, a network that democratized learning and transformed education across an entire continent. The fact that their creation was ultimately replaced by something even more effective doesn't diminish their achievement. It confirms that the best innovations create the conditions for their own obsolescence. The university book trade of the Middle Ages proves that revolutionary change often comes not from single brilliant inventions, but from the patient accumulation of small improvements over generations. Every technique that made printing successful, from quality control to distribution networks to customer service, had been refined through centuries of manuscript production. When Gutenberg's press finally arrived, it succeeded so quickly because the hard work of building a book-based culture had already been done by countless forgotten scribes, stationers, and students working one picia at a time. So there you have it. The incredible story of how medieval university stationers built the world's first mass-production book network using nothing but quills, parchment, and pure business genius. These weren't just simple shopkeepers. They were the logistics masterminds who cracked the code on knowledge distribution centuries before anyone dreamed of printing presses or Amazon delivery trucks. The Picia system proved that revolutionary change doesn't always come from flashy new technology. Sometimes it comes from taking existing tools and organizing them so brilliantly that you transform an entire civilization. Those stationers turned the slow, expensive world of monastery copying into a high-speed academic highway where ideas could travel faster than ever before. When Gutenberg finally fired up his printing press in the 1440s, he wasn't starting from scratch. He was plugging into a system that medieval scribes and stationers had spent 2 centuries perfecting. Every challenge that printing faced, from quality control to distribution networks, had already been solved by generations of Picia masters working one rental at a time. The next time you grab a textbook, download an ebook, or stream a lecture online, remember those forgotten heroes of medieval Paris and Bologna. They built the foundation for everything that followed, proving that the best innovations don't replace existing systems. They evolve from them. And who knows, maybe the next revolutionary breakthrough in education is already taking shape in some corner of the internet, just waiting for someone clever enough to see the pattern.